broadcast. Tonight's broadcast really is an overview of the treatment continuum. And I think when I was thinking about what topic to present on tonight, I think this addresses, I think, most of the common questions that I get from parents as they move through this process. Both the parents on the front end that are part of the inquiry process, and then also after they enter the program about what's going to happen next. And of course, a tremendous amount of interest and anxiety at times can occur when thinking about considering about having your child come home or leave a residential treatment center, residential treatment program of some kind. So with that I'm going to be covering that long continuum, and I'm going to be covering, hopefully, the principles that are involved in it. As I often talk about, and I think the value for me that I think about in doing these webinars and then in the writing that I do is it's really about learning how to think differently, right? It's about a way of thinking about things, a sensibility, a way of being in relationship to our children and to their challenges and to their problems. I don't think that a lot of parenting can be legislated. I don't think it can be, we can use a lot of templates. I know the skills can help. I talk about that all the time, about how skills and tools can help. But without a direction, without an overall paradigm or way of being in relationship with somebody, those tools and skills can be hollow. So as I talk about moving through the process, I'm also going to be suggesting or talking about a way of thinking about your child's progress, your family's progress throughout this entire process. I'm going to touch on wilderness and why it works, how it works, why it's effective. Like I've said many times, what drew me into wilderness was over about 22 years ago, and my introduction to it was I had never seen anything so dynamic, so powerful. And sometimes it's just as complicated, as simple as it can be. It's really just a delivery method, right? You can overlay all the traditional therapies, all the evidence-based therapies, and then you're doing it in the outdoors. And while that was helpful 22 years ago, I almost want to say it's essential today. Some people will call it a digital detox, right? Getting away from screens, getting away from computers, social media, a lot of things that can distract us, that can numb us, that can help us not to feel what we need to feel in order to progress and to grow emotionally and spiritually and psychologically. The use of metaphors or rituals in the wilderness can be very powerful. Metaphor, when using metaphor, it's a way to bypass resistance, right? If I come in through the front door teaching your child something, which of course we do at times, but think about it this way. You walk in through the front door and you're oftentimes going to be met with resistance. You start talking in metaphor, allegories, examples, and automatically the recognition that the individual receiving the metaphor has for that to be the principle that they want to fight against, that they want to separate themselves, individuate from, is minimized. It's mitigated. Using a sports analogy, a music analogy, an analogy from business or education, you're still teaching the principles, but you're not directly coming into contact with and provoking the defense that's often associated with this need to individuate, right? The defensiveness to look into oneself. The positive peer milieu, there's something so powerful with what happens in a wilderness group. Even though there are other treatment approaches that can have a small group milieu, in our case, it's between 7 and 10 clients or students. Even though that's still possible, something is more powerful when you're relying on each other to live, right? Think about going to a school, going to a therapeutic program, living in a dorm. You're going to have a similar experience, let's say, with your roommate, but to have to incorporate 7 or 8 other people into your daily functioning, into your meals, into your cleaning up camp, into your hike to the next location. All of that is a rich soil to understand what's going on, to plant seeds, and to help people move through their issues in real time. So it's not just about the concepts we teach, it's about what's going on. In wellness therapy, it's show it to me. Let's see it come up. Let's treat it in real time. With resistant adolescents and young adults. When I think about adolescents, I think about the adolescent brain, which we think goes until about the age of 25. and where individuation is a key concept. And resistance is, at times, a sense of survival for the adolescent brain, right? If I don't differentiate from my parents, I can't survive, right? I have to become my own person and make my own way in the world. So resistance is incredibly effectively bypassed in this process. Self-esteem, self-efficacy, what I do makes a difference. And again, you're talking about, in some cases, building a fire by rubbing sticks together. But in all spaces in the wilderness, you're talking about going through something very, very difficult. I remember some early cases that I had back in the 1990s. And I remember some of them that where there was minimal progress. They were few and far between, comparatively speaking. But I remember some of my difficult cases. And I remember noticing at the time of transition in these cases that often there was still a very powerful awakening of esteem. I made it through something tough. I'm from Southern California, so I can say this. I used to get that Southern California kid, right, who was comfortable with the weather, and then they were being introduced to the outdoors, to the weather, to the winter, and they were saying to me over and over again, I can't do this. Right? And they believe this. And we empathize, and we're nurturing and sensitive, but in essence, with our very presence, we're saying, I think you can, I think you're wrong. And then, of course, they make it. They develop an incredible sense of efficacy, of what I do makes a difference. And they also develop a sense of resiliency. Like, I can overcome something uncomfortable, something difficult. So self-esteem and all of that, all that's underneath that umbrella is a powerful part of it. Rites of passage, right? We don't have a lot of rites of passage that are celebrated and punctuated in our society. And so we do a lot of ceremony, moving from stage to stage, awarding them tokens and beads that really reflect what's going on in their inner process, the sense of accomplishment. I had one student who, one of my most incredible cases, an opiate addict, heroin addict, and he told me one week that he was hiking up this difficult hill with the rest of the group, and he just got inspired, and he thought, if I can make it up this hill, I can do anything. And I remember sitting with him in session, thinking, this feels a little bit contrived, a little bit superficial. 15 years later, this young man still remains in contact with me and still remembers that hike up the mountain. Not all of it happens that perfectly, is framed that perfectly, like a storybook. But overall, that's the experience of I'm accomplishing something very difficult. Identity, who am I? Part of what happens when you're exposed to hardship, to difficulty, to challenge, is the sense of who am I, right? There's two parts to us with our identity. There's who am I and where do I belong? And both of those things are addressed very powerfully, very dynamically in a wilderness group. The group becomes a microcosm for the family. Over and over again, year after year, our therapists, I experience parents telling us on the first phone call, after we give our update, you get my kid, you see him, because they can't help but show up. They get exposed, right? I haven't even mentioned the staff shift being 8 days, but 8-day staff shifts. That's what our staff do out there. They start on a Tuesday morning and they end on the following Tuesday evening. They overlap for 1 day. There's a level of consistency, of seamlessness in all of that, right? Accentuated by the powerful peer culture, the positive peer culture that I was describing earlier. And you get what's like a family. You get somebody that reminds you of your father, your mother, your brother, your sister, your girlfriend, your boyfriend, your teachers, right? It shows up. Even those students that are very therapy savvy, that can fake good, get exposed in this process. The removal of distractions and defenses, and I said that at the outset of this broadcast, that I think it was helpful in 2006, 2005, 2004. It was helpful back then. And today it's life-giving to be pulled out of the digital world and to be introduced back into nature. And research tells us that people in nature, that their brain functioning changes. Some people call the wilderness experience the silence, a noble silence, a quietude. one of my early mentors said to me, wilderness therapy is spending time with yourself and seeing how you like the company. The inability to manipulate wilderness, I've experienced this many times. I used to tell the story about a session I was having. It was in October in Utah. October in the wilderness in Utah was one of my least favorite seasons. It wasn't cold enough to snow, and of course it wasn't warm anymore. And so there was a rainy, cold day that I was conducting my sessions in. And I wanted to finish my sessions in the comfort of my car, which is a taboo, was a taboo, right? Unless it was a safety issue, you don't do something like that for comfort. So I'm sitting in I can't really get a fire because it just keeps smoking. We're sitting in my shelter. We're both, me and the student and the staff that I'm sitting with, are in sleeping bags, keeping ourselves warm, but it's really uncomfortable. And in between sessions, I leaned over to Steve, the staff, and I said, I'll give you 5 minutes to convince me not to have the rest of the sessions in my car. And he said one thing, one simple line. He said, just show the students how to suffer. And it gave me all the motivation that I need. And I realized he's right. This is difficult. This is uncomfortable. But this is we learn how to feel. It's difficult. I had a student walk up to us. We were having a staff discussion in the desert sometime in summer. And the student walked up, started complaining about that it was his time to take a bath, that he didn't want to do it, and there was so much dust, and he was going to get dirty anyway. And one of the staff tried to talk him out of it. And I said, hold on just a second. I said, it's hard. It's hard to live out here. It's hard to live primitively. It's hard to live with the elements that you can't control. I get it. You're right. It makes sense. And the student just absorbed it and walked away and took his bath. And I spent some time teaching the staff. I said, everything out here takes work. Things that we can do at home, in our houses, with indoor plumbing, with cars. You know, all of that is easy. We take it for granted. Out here, you can take nothing for granted. You can't take hydration for granted. You can't take skin safety for granted, bugs, hot and cold. Everything is work. It's not punitive, but it's challenging. And that's where, like I said on the back end, that sense of accomplishment, efficacy come in, and esteem come in. The inability to work with nature. I remember when I was doing my own family visit to my son when he's in wilderness, and it was raining. And I remember thinking, why did I have to schedule a visit on a day that was raining day and night? And I remember thinking, I've been doing this at the time, I'd been doing it for 10 years as a wilderness therapist, but something about my personal visit to my son felt like it was being intruded upon. And I just remember thinking, I just have to accept this. I just have to radically accept this and breathe through it. And what can it teach me? And I think so many of us are successful at manipulating our environment so often, but there's nothing you can do to fight Mother Nature, the rain, the snow, the heat, and so forth. The sterile assessment environment is that it's a very contained group, right? There's not a lot of outside distractions. They don't get to go off and have one-on-one conversations. We don't allow that for safety, for emotional safety, right? Everything is within the group. You can have individual sessions with staff and with therapists, but with each other, everything is within the group. And so you get an environment, an observation that isn't tainted by media, by outside communication, and the like. The removal of negative influences or the supervised negative experience, right? I've had students who inadvertently got placed in the same group who knew each other. That happens on occasion back home. And most of the time, parents immediately want to split them up. But oftentimes, we were able to convince them to, let's see how it works at first. I wish I could do that every time. I wish I could take two people back home that were interacting in ways that led to negative behavior all the time, so we could treat it. Sometimes we end up separating because it becomes too distracting and they're both too vulnerable. But oftentimes it's something that we can treat and we get to observe them, right? They're always being observed. There's something called earshot that the participants talk about. And what that is this principle that they don't talk outside of the staff's earshot. Right? We're not listening to every word of every conversation, but they're having it within our earshot all the time. So negative influences are mitigated. There's a vulnerability. You're outside of your comfort zone physically and emotionally. Even students who have been participants who have been exposed to camping, there's something more raw about all of this. And that rawness leads to an openness, to a vulnerability. It's hard to maintain this kind of surface level compliance, right? Behavioral cooperation, because you're going to get frustrated with the group, with each other, with the elements that's going to be exposed. The development of interdependence, right? That's that idea about that we can advocate for ourselves and rely on each other. We can ask for help. That's an important part that not a lot of young people do very well, let alone us old people. And it's weird. The therapists bring out fruit, the staff bring out food. They teach them how to build their shelters at night, how to pack up their packs so that it's more comfortable, how to tie and adjust it. So you're not just teaching them about school. You're not just teaching them about math or science or psychology or communication or family relationships or drugs or depression. Those are all the front door conversations. But you're having a relationship with them where they need you to survive or to at least be comfortable. And that changes the relationship. And the futility of old coping mechanisms within this safe container, right? They try, a lot of your children will try the same old things for several weeks. And they're not going to be inclined to change until they've recognized in this new environment the futility of the old escape routes. And so that's an important part of the process. I want to tell you one more thing that just came into my mind about metaphors, about the metaphor of wilderness. It was my first student. And I remember we were on a hike. Back in those days, I used to hike while I did sessions, and we stopped doing that a long time ago because there's so much reading and writing, and we get out of breath, and it can be difficult. So most of our sessions are done during layover days. But I remember walking with him, and he was vacillating between a conversation about his family, the difficulty, the conflict, the fighting, and the difficulty with his pack. And he had packed his pack very poorly that morning, and it was tall and leaning over to one side. And he would complain about it. And it was beautiful, where I realized, as we were walking, I realized I can't tell what he's talking about sometimes. Sometimes I think he's talking about his pack and the hike, and sometimes he's talking about his family. Sometimes when children say to me about wilderness therapy, I don't like this, I don't want to be here, I can't do this, I listen to it with an ear that assumes they're talking about life. When I was camping with some Boy Scouts, I'd been asked by my local Boy Scout director to take the kids out to winter camping. They had to get a winter camping badge experience. I actually brought one of my staff along, one of my senior staff, because he was much better at it than I was. We brought all the Boy Scouts out. And they were having a great time, but they were so difficult to manage, and it was getting cold and night was falling, and we were struggling all day with them to build their shelters, to cook their dinners. We ended up eating half burnt and half frozen foil dinners. They were having snowball fights, and we were saying things like, I know that seems fun right now, but the temperature's about to drop dramatically, and all those wet shirts, those wet socks that you have now are going to be dangerous later. And it was a very frustrating, difficult afternoon and evening for me. And after we got them all to bed, all safe, I laid down at night next to the staff member that was hosting this, that was really leading this for me. And I said, how do you guys do this? Like, on your weeks off, you go camping. We were laying on top of 5 or 6 feet of packed snow up in the canyons in Utah. I said, how do you do this? And he said so plainly, so matter-of-factly, he just said, it doesn't get any more real than this. The first staff member, not clinically minded, but the first staff member that I ever talked to when I started doing this, I said, what is wilderness therapy? And he said, Brad, it's on the ground. And most people don't live on the ground. He was speaking, of course, mystically and metaphorically and poetically. But I think there's some truth to it. That there's something so basic about primitive living, and it offers these lessons, these opportunities, these metaphors. And it becomes very powerful. It becomes a very powerful foundation. Like I said, it's a sophisticated and comprehensive clinical model in a beautiful delivery method. That's what wilderness therapy is. So what are our goals and objectives? These are some. It's a wake-up call. I think a lot of people think of it like that because it's a shock to the system. It's a culture shock. It gets their attention and creates a new bottom for them. It buys some time for a family in a crisis, right? You don't want to make long-term decisions in a crisis. So it sets a pause for the family and intervenes and gets everybody safe. There's obviously therapeutic benefit, and that depends on the individual participant, the therapeutic approach, what are the objectives, but it's therapy. In my estimation, it's some of the most comprehensive clinical work I've ever seen. And I go around and I visited, by this point, hundreds of treatment programs, all different models that I respect. I don't see any that surpass wilderness therapy's clinical sophistication, at least what we introduced into to the industry, to the field, back in the late 1980s. So there's therapeutic benefit, all of the evidence-based models that you would use in any kind of setting. It's an assessment. It provides the family, the consultant, evaluative feedback. You know, what's going on, what works and what doesn't. I say to the staff to help them stay in a position where it's something they can control and something where they won't lose, which is, even if the child is resistant, I want you to tell me the 2 or 3 or 4 things you tried this week that didn't work. And when you can do that, we're learning something. You know, peer feedback doesn't work. Solo time doesn't work. Confrontation doesn't work. Right? Written assignment, whatever it is, tell me what doesn't work. And then we can start to discover what does work. So the evaluation, the feedback we get is the supervision, the experience, the microcosm is so comprehensive. It's a rich feedback process. I think one of the greatest challenges for a lot of our families is you go from wilderness therapy to virtually any other setting, and all of that gets watered down a little bit. For various reasons that I've shared, the staff, the level of sophistication, the level of intensity, and so forth, as it should be. People don't need to, ought not to be in this level of care for months and years of their life. Right? This is a primary care setting. So we provide the evaluation, the assessment, the feedback. The family therapy work. That's something that we changed. That was not a part of wilderness therapy before we founded our program in 1998. Right? Family work. You're on a webinar, obviously you know this. And really, for me, it's the relentlessness with which I think we talk about it. You know, we push it. It's not just a one-time drive-by thing. We tell you all the time the need, the benefit. And I think some people might be resistant to that, struggle with that, resentful of that. But most of our families will dip their foot in the pool, right? Taste a little bit off the plate, and they'll find this wonderful benefit. They'll find that it improves their life. They'll find that what the work that we're doing isn't about just their children, that it's about them, and that change can have a wonderful impact on their child, but it's not about the child. They'll say to me things like, it changes all of my relationships, changes my relationships at home with my wife, with my husband, with my employees, employers, my coworkers, my own family of origin, and so forth and so on. So family work and our commitment to offer what I think is a compassionate, persistent amount of family support and education. Preparation for the next step. I talk about these stages of resistance to resignation, to acceptance, to investment. Right? That students, participants move through those stages. Just like I mentioned, the parents dip their foot in the pool. These children are dipping their foot, being required to dip their foot in the pool, and then they move through the stages. They get invested in their care. They see how it's worked, and they want it to continue. And there's a softening effect, taking off the sharp edges of demonstrative and dangerous behaviors so that you can qualify for a level of care, for a longer-term level of care, that you couldn't qualify for had you not come to Wilderness. So part of our work is to get people ready for a different level of care. People that skip Wilderness, other programs report this to us, families report this to us, they oftentimes struggle with significant disruptive behaviors. You know, we all know what the phrase high ceiling is, right? You want a high ceiling in a program. Opportunities, right? Opportunities for autonomy and choices and exposure to the quote unquote real world. But we also pay attention to the floor. How low is the floor? And wellness therapy has a pretty low floor. We can handle some pretty demonstrative kids. Self-harming, suicidal ideation, right? Rebellious, disruptive, non-compliant. We can handle a lot. It just works well with these small groups and the container that we have. We can be patient with them and compassionate with them and non-punitive and non-behavioral in the process. And over time, those sharp edges get smoothed out a little bit. So they're ready for a different kind of care. Families, sometimes their children will say to me, if I'm going to go to aftercare, why don't I just go now? Why do I have to be here? And my answer is because you'll have a different aftercare that you'll qualify for, right? It won't be the same aftercare program, the same school as it would be if you didn't go through this program. It'll be different. That's what I call the softening effect. Changing levels of long-term care or aftercare, that fits with that. Socialization skills, it's a wonderful place to practice socialization skills because you can't get away from each other. You know what it's like. We know what it's like when you spend a lot of time with somebody that even as a good friend, go on vacation with a good friend. Spend 4 or 5 days with somebody on a business trip, a colleague that you get along with, and you both like each other. And we realize it's harder, right? That's why families are so hard. I love it when people say to me, when clients and students would say to me, I get along with my friends, just my family. And I say to them, realistically, family relationships are really the only measure of our mental health, right? I used to say to them, if you're not getting along with your friends, you're crazy. It's easy to get along with friends, relatively speaking, because you can walk away from each other. You can't walk away from mom and dad, brother and sister. So that's really the test of how healthy all of us are. It's not absolutely true, but it's I used to use it as a discussion. So learning to socialize and becoming more like family, that microcosm is something that is challenged, that is assessed, that is treated, that is changed. The assessment that both from the natural observation that I've mentioned all throughout, that we're watching them and that they're in this setting where they get exposed, to objective testing that can be provided out here while they're in a stable, substance-free environment. You know, so much more effective than somebody in outpatient care. There are various models. I'm not going to go into this a lot. There is a webinar on best fit aftercare, how to choose the best fit. There's one stage or two-stage model. Sometimes you'll go from here to a secondary care to a step-down program. Sometimes you'll go straight to a step-down program, then to an IOP, which is intensive outpatient, or just outpatient therapy, or traditional school, traditional college, small college. So there's all kinds of settings. Length of stay varies. Oftentimes the more intense ones are going to be shorter length. Sometimes the step downs are going to be longer, but that can also vary. How much tolerance do they have? That's that floor idea that I was talking about. How much and early on in my career, I saw great progress, and I was too optimistic in my recommendations and assessment because this is a strange concept, but wellness therapy is also, because of what I've said all along, is the most supportive environment that these students, clients are often in, right? In other words, in many ways, not in all ways, some ways it's challenging, like I said, but clinically, it oftentimes is the easiest place that they'll ever be. And so these other settings with different staff shifts, different level of intensity, different priorities, right? They get introduced into school and in work sometimes. I use the juggling analogy, right? At Evoke, we teach your children to juggle with 3 balls, and we get pretty good at it. They get pretty good at it. Then they leave us, and they get handed 2 or 3 more balls, and they drop them all, right? They can't juggle 6 balls, so they drop them all. Have they forgotten how to juggle? No. But they were only being asked 3, and now 3 more have been introduced. And so that becomes part of the process for them. Choices and regression, right? How much opportunity, temptation, how many choices are they provided? And understanding that regression is a part of it. I think that can be difficult, especially with parents that have been traumatized so much by their children's choices. And so regression is a trigger. We can have a post-traumatic stress reaction to it. But understanding that within a certain context, with safety nets, we want to have them have the opportunity for some regression so that we can treat it. It's a buffer, right? It's a buffer between you and them. Wilderness is a bigger buffer, and the more liberal the environments, the thinner the buffer, right? You get a phone call and a letter once a week from us, and we give you the week's report. Some of these schools and programs, they get their cell phone back, right? That's on the most liberal end, and then there's everywhere in between. So the question is everybody ready for that kind of integration, or are we going to see triggers and regression and hopelessness and frustration get so significant that things come to us to a halt? How clinical is it? How much academic is involved? What kind of academic support is there? Does your child have a learning difference? It needs to be accounted for, supported, accommodated. Is it a highly academic setting where there's a lot of pressure? Is that something that they can do well with? How much parent involvement, right? And that involves that question comes up in a lot of ways. How much family involvement, parent involvement is necessary? How much of it is beneficial? How much of it is wanted by anybody? All of that becomes part of the question. Mental health or addiction or both. A lot of programs will call themselves dual diagnosis, which means they treat both. Some are and some aren't. Some are better at it than others. We have some fantastic dual diagnoses therapists at Evoke. And that's why when I go around and hear about it and I talk to them, I don't see that kind of quality, that kind of commitment to both. Co-ed, should it be co-ed or not? Typically, with adolescents, I tend to think that co-ed isn't necessary, isn't beneficial, although lots of people want it. Young adults, it's more often co-ed, although some sober living environments and sober homes and treatment programs are single gender. With all else being equal, I don't have a lot of opinion about which it should be, but it's something that the therapists will ask, is it relevant to your child? Is it a family smile, so there's small group home type experiences? Is it transitional or step down program where they're going to the local college, going to the local school, getting a job in the community? Residential treatment centers, right? That's more therapeutic. Therapeutic boarding school it feels a little bit more mainstream. Programs outside of the U.S., which give them other experiences, Costa Rica, Samoa, and the like. They get cultural immersion. And again, cultural immersion and exposure is another way to bypass resistance, right? Because the culture doesn't look and smell and sound and taste like our culture, but they teach so many of the same values. I loved when I visited Samoa years ago because the emphasis on family and we was such a juxtaposition from American culture and helped bring a lot of those young men into balance. 12-step treatment center or oftentimes just focus on substance abuse. So those are kind of more old school 12-step, more challenging and confrontational sometimes. Is it experiential? Right? Did they do well here? Was that one of those elements that we identified here that had a positive and dramatic effect on them? And so does it have experiential learning, service, travel, outdoor even, recreation? Is there something that they can do recreationally that they really enjoy and thrive with? It still can be met. All of their clinical needs can be met. Making sure you prioritize which is most important. A sober living environment, which they vary, but it's an environment where it's sober, there's some accountability, and there's minimal programming, but they make sure they teach young adults how to live on their own, those kinds of experiences. Wellness therapists think about criteria. How much family involvement versus individual treatment is there? Is this more about treating the individual, or do we involve the family? Is it a systemic approach? That depends upon the age of the child, the diagnosis, the family willingness, and then how much they're going to benefit. Physical activity. Is it more systemically driven, meaning that you can kind of plug them in with any therapist? Or is it more therapist driven, mentor driven, or therapist relationship driven? Sometimes, see, the benefit of the system is that's kind of more like society, school, work, and so forth. So people that are more ready, more flexible, more bandwidth can do that. The relational model is more supportive in a way, or just appeals to a different temperament. Do they have a lot of home visits? What age are they? Of course, that relates. Home visits are practice. Home visits are those visits where you say, okay, we've done some rehearsals, but now we're going to kind of have a scrimmage. We're going to see what it's like. We've done practice, now we're going to have a scrimmage, and we're going to struggle, and then we're going to go back to the drawing board and say, what did we learn? What do we need to do different? Is it a group approach or an individual approach? Close to home, far from home? What's the social milieu look like? Again, we start to line up all these different kinds of priorities, all these different kinds of characteristics, and then we prioritize them. What's the most important? Why is my consultant putting schools on the list that seem to have a variance in treatment models? Part of why they do that sometimes is to have you go through the thinking process, because part of it is dependent upon what you want, what you're comfortable with, what you're ready for. And sometimes I have parents that are seeking and striving toward a more liberal approach, right? A more liberal milieu. But they're not quite ready for it when they get there. And it's harder than a more conservative or structured setting. Will my therapist give me some additional schools? Typically, we don't do that. If you're working with a consultant at home, which we recommend, that school list, those lists of schools come from the therapist in a sense, because the therapist is giving information to the consultant and they're translating it into recommendations for schools. How do you decide what to do? You're the consumer, you're the one who gets to decide. We advise, we teach, we suggest. Talk to your therapist, talk to your home therapist, talk to an education consultant, talk to parents on reference lists, visit schools and program, talk to the admissions folks. Your child's not going to be working with the admissions folks, but oftentimes the culture of the admissions folks can give you a sense of the culture of the program. On tours, talk with students and clients. And again, you run all of this through your parent filter, through your adult filter. It would be unwise to take everything at face value, but it can start to fill in a picture. Why won't professionals sometimes give me their best choice, their number one choice? And the answer is because we want you to decide. I think in an ideal world, with adolescents, you get 2 or 3 choices, because none of them are going to be perfect with perfect people. And there's something about taking on ownership. And if you're given a list of 2 or 3 programs, all of those have passed muster, right? All of those are qualified. All of those are good enough in the mind of the consultant and the therapist. So that's, then within that, you get to choose. And your preferences, your desires, your gut, your instincts, your prayerful thought, if that's how you find the truth, right? However you find the truth, it's yours. Money challenges, of course, can be an absolute practical aspect of it. We all don't have unlimited funds. And so you're allowed to make decisions based on that. There are insurance advocates out there that can help you with this process. We'll recommend them to you if you would like to know of those, and they can they're bulldogs at getting insurance for families, and they can often be very effectively. Why can't I have more choices? Sometimes consultants won't give you more choices because they're not willing to give you choices outside of what they feel comfortable with. That can happen sometimes. And I've seen it both ways. You could say this is outside of my recommendation, but part of what they're doing is they're recommending what works, and they might give you 2 or 3 or 4 choices. And if you're looking for something that doesn't fit their recommendations, you might not get that fifth or sixth recommendation. In the end, you have to own it, go with your gut, make the decision the best way that you know how, and then turn it over to your child, right? It's theirs now. It's theirs to make successful. Let's talk about the process. We call this process ending at Evoke transition instead of graduation. We call it because we don't think of it as a finishing point. It's a transitioning from one place, one level of care, one experience to another. And we talk all the time about the journey, not the destination. Very few students complete the phases because we designed it that way. Because we didn't want them to have the experience that I've completed my mental health. I've now arrived at being mentally healthy, because we're all on that journey until the day we die. Hopefully we never arrive. So it's more about the journey. Part of the process is your regression, right? Your relapse. When parents will talk to me about relapse and regression, I oftentimes want to ask them, what about yours? What have you done? What's been your experience? What's your relapse prevention plan? One of my favorite, I'll say two things that I really love to hear. I really love to hear from parents. Number one is when they give me a short description of an experience with their child, maybe visiting colleges or a home pass or whatever it is. And they say, it didn't go so well. He or she acted out in some old ways, but I did it differently. I learned to respond differently. That's the important thing I have to report. Then I know they get it. That's what this is all about, is you doing it differently. The second thing that I really enjoy hearing from parents, really value, honor, and respect, is when a parent comes to a parent support group, a parent experience, and says, usually this is after the child is out of our program for some time, out of aftercare, and says, yeah, they're not doing well right now, but I'm doing okay. Right? They've found ways to differentiate themselves from their children. They still support their children. They still love their children. They're still there for their children if their children need them in a way that they can feel comfortable giving. But they haven't absolutely tied themselves. That old adage of you're only as happy as your least happy child, it's nuts. It's inappropriate. It's a burden the child need not carry. It's not their responsibility. And we think that that's love. We think that that's an expression of love. It's not an expression of love. It's an expression of dependence. And yes, I know, because I have 4 children who have been through various levels of success and struggle and failure and pain. And I know this as a father. It's a painful process. Nothing more painful in my life than the experiences of being related to other people in my family. The difficulties, the pain, the stress, the anxiety, the failures, the heartbreak that we've all had. Using transition as a time to evaluate the family progress, using home visits, using phone calls. When it's good, it's good. When it's bad, it's good, because there's something to learn from it. She still wants to see her boyfriend or friends or use some drugs. What do? You follow through with your aftercare plan. You follow through with your consequences. You follow through with your actions. Right? This is why we often recommend aftercare, is because even though they've had a lot of success here, even though things have stabilized here, those desires are still in them. And oftentimes when parents visit, they hear old requests, old desires kind of creep and leak out of the child. And they think, I thought we were past this. And not totally. It takes time. I thought we had talked about this and settled it. It's like, they say that you're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. I think that's sort of true. Right? Because obviously I've had 4 children, so I've been through the process as a father 4 times. And there's pregnancy when you find out your wife is pregnant as a father, speaking from a father's perspective. That's one thing. And so you feel the excitement, whatever comes with that. Then there's the pregnancy when your wife gets sick, if that's something that happens. Then there's the pregnancy when she starts feeling comfortable with her body growing. Then there's the first time you feel the baby kick, the first sonogram, the first heartbeat, right? Then there's labor. Then there's birth. Then there's taking the child home from the hospital. So even though, technically speaking, you only get, in this example, you only get pregnant once, but there There are new pieces to it, new awarenesses, new levels of it. I remember when I took my second child home from the hospital while my first child was only 2 years old. I remember thinking, this is different. Just this moment. Two of them. Now we're kind of evenly numbered. My wife has one, I have one, and now we both have to be on all the time. Or if we're alone, they outnumber us. I talk about during the transition process to adolescence, and sometimes parents take young adults. Oftentimes they go by themselves. But I'll say, make your parents sad to drop you off, not grateful to drop you off, not relieved to drop you off. Can you do that? Or is this just going to be an opportunity for you to slide back into old patterns of manipulation? And transition will hurt no matter how well you're prepared. I think for most families, going from evoke to a therapeutic placement afterwards, a longer term one, I think for many people that's more painful, more difficult, because it's longer. And we're excited and we've seen progress and we've reconnected. We've experienced some beautiful things together. And that's hard. And aftercare is less dynamic. Right? It's not a crisis, it's not primary. It's to be more like real life. Be prepared in the next setting for that regression. Like I said, that's part of the process. It's a bigger box. Wilderness is a smaller box, which is something that people complain about. Kids complain about. Young adults complain about. It's a small box. But it also means that, like I said, it's easier to negotiate. So when the bigger box shows up, there's more choices. The emotional safety, it's more like life, right? You're having regular staff shifts, more staff, teachers. You're around more people that don't have therapeutic training at the level that a therapist and a wilderness field staff has, right? You might be engaged in the community. And so all of a sudden, it's like being a little child in your shelter, and then you're moving out to the world, and it doesn't always go as well and as supportive as wilderness does. You have to balance therapy with other spheres of life. And at Evoke in wilderness, therapy comes first. Right after physical safety, we'll interrupt anything for therapy virtually. Whereas some programs expect you to be able to make it through your math class without needing to have a standing group or a therapy session. At Evoke, because of the level of care that we're at, unless there's physical safety, we're going to stop a lot of things if a child needs to or wants to have a therapeutic discussion. It's often less individually focused than we are, right? We have great ratios, staff to student ratios, so we can give them a lot of attention. The pace of change is slower. You are insulated less from your child. That's that buffer idea that I described. Prepare yourselves for in most cases, not everyone, but in most cases, a different level of customer service due to the different stage of the treatment process, right? You have family coordinators, you have these webinars, although you get these webinars for life now that you've been to Evoke. You don't have that much that you have at Evoke. The parent portal, the letters, the parent coordinator, the therapist call, the archived webinars, the live webinars, the student journal, the pictures, right? You're not going to have that much, and so because it's more like real life. Don't be surprised when you get the letter in the first month or so that says, this is not the right place. These people are worse than I am. I can do this at home. I can do the same thing. I can do just as well at home. I don't need this. Don't be surprised when you get that. That's a time to breathe, to talk to your therapist, to talk to the therapist at the program, to not have a knee-jerk reaction, and to know that this is a part of it. This is a typical part of the process. You're going to have phone calls with and without the therapist. So again, that insulation is missing. You're going to be exposed to them. You're going to have to learn how in real time to respond with healthy, authentic, compassionate, kind, and strong boundaries. I tell parents this is not about getting it right. This is about becoming a student and learning. Even in my experience, if you can't ask difficult questions of your therapist at Evoke, I teach this all the time to our therapists, but at any program, they're not really serving you. So be a student. And if you get coached or corrected, talk about it. It happened to me in family therapy last week with my own child, my 15-year-old. The therapist said something that just didn't sound right to me. So I brought it up in session today, this morning, in family therapy. And we had a great discussion. He was fantastic with it. And then home visits. Home visits are to practice, right? It's not just to celebrate. It's to figure out what's working, what do we need to work on. So some take-home principles. They or you are not fixed, right? This is a process. Mental health is not healthy and unhealthy. It's a continuum with at each end of the continuums, very dramatic differences. But we're all on this continuum somewhere. And the goal is to make progress until we die, right? Those people who arrive, those people are hard to be around. And you probably know some of them. Maybe some of you arrived earlier and realized you haven't really arrived. I know that's been an experience that I've had in my life where I've thought I've arrived. But the people that are my people, the people that I connect to, can understand me, are the people who never arrive. They're always learning. Our aftercare bias, I talked about this during the open forum earlier this week. It comes from experience, not theoretically. We believe it from our experience because it's shown it to us. We believe that it's beneficial. I love this story. I had somebody who owns and still does a wraparound program where there's a mentor and a parent coach, and they work together. And she said to me years ago, she said, there's basically 3 families that she works with. There's families where both of the parent and the child are motivated. There's parents where neither one of them are motivated. And then there's situations where the parents are motivated and the children aren't. She said there's not really any programs, any families where the children are motivated and the parents aren't. So she said there's basically those 3, and she said, obviously we have great success where both parent and child are motivated. And she said when both of them are unmotivated, we have very little success. But she said with the ones that she called chasers, the ones where the parent was motivated but the child wasn't, she said we have just as much success with those as we do when both are motivated. So what's the key factor, the common denominator there is if the parent is motivated, we can work with you. That's what she was saying to me. So you stay motivated and know that they've got an adolescent brain, which part of it comes with looking to the future and planning and cause and effect. And I've spent a lot of time, because I have adult children now, being frustrated with adolescents because they wouldn't learn something, expecting them to act like adults, right? We do that a lot. A parent said to me one time, I was speaking to a group of parents, elementary school age parents. I had some parents invite me to speak to their community, and they brought up elementary school aged children, parents of children. That makes sense. The children of these parents were elementary school age, and this one mother asked me this question. She said, I can get my 9-year-old to do chores. I can get him to, if I have consequences. But then she started describing, she said, but he doesn't get it. Like, he doesn't see what it's like to be part of a family. Doesn't see the value, doesn't want to do it. What do I do? I said, 9-year-olds don't get it. That's their deal. They're 9-year-olds. Sometimes 16-year-olds, sometimes 22-year-olds don't get it. And so trying to fight that battle doesn't make sense and ends up in what we would call controlling behaviors. And so what you do is you stay consistent with your boundaries. Right? You just stay consistent. And over time they'll get it. They'll get it because that's how children learn. They learn from the outside in, not the inside out. We want our children to learn from the inside out. Why? Often so we don't have to have these boundaries. We don't have to fight those battles. And it's because how we think, right? We get an insight, an aha moment, and then our behavior changes. For children, oftentimes it's the external stuff that helps them to change and shapes them. So when we expect something developmentally that they're not equipped to do, it's some kind of abuse, right? And we all do it. The research tells us that black and white thinking and communication skills are critically important for maintaining success beyond therapy, beyond therapeutic approaches. I talk about behavioral contracts. People ask me about behavioral contracts all the time, and I've given lectures on it. I have a template that I've shared with people. But let me tell you this. The behavioral contract does not do the work for you. I think the value of a behavioral contract is that it gives you clarity. To this day, in 22 years, I've never seen a child violate his or her behavioral contract, have it pointed out to them by their parents, and heard the child say, you know what, you're right. I didn't follow through with what I said I was going to do, and the consequence makes sense. I've never seen that to this day that I can recall. So it just gives you confidence that you've been clear. It's for you, it's not for them. And if you expect it to do the work for you, it doesn't. So do it to get clear, but understand you're still going to have to fight the battle. You're still going to have to follow through. They'll complain of some loophole, or that they signed or agreed to it out of duress. Right? They'll change the rules. They'll change the paradigm. So you still have to do the same work. Now, we want you to go to meetings. We want you to go to therapy. Doing all this. If you're on this webinar, that's a good sign. Equip yourself with parent thinking. Read my book, The Journey of the Rogue Parent. Start to listen to the podcasts. All of these webinars are recorded on podcasts the night that I finish them. Take risks. Learn something. Be vulnerable yourself and model that. Start to understand your own co-participation, and try to get out of the guilt and shame. Right? That hinders you. I have webinars on guilt and shame, so go to those if you need to. There's a chapter in my book on shame. It's not an effective way to parent. It's not an effective way to live. Developing response flexibility means that we have an awareness. Right? We've had an awakening. We understand where our limitations. We understand how our pasts affect us, how our childhood affects us. We don't have all the answers, but we have some. We have a foundation so that we can respond flexibly, thoughtfully, instead of reactively with our children. And then embrace the journey and walk slowly. Walking slowly is a Buddhist concept. It's the idea that you never arrive. You're already there. And you can have happiness and peace in the present moment, no matter what the situation is. All right, I'm happy to answer any questions. What are the most common pitfalls experienced upon return home, and how can these best be avoided? What is the most important factor in successful transition? I think the most common pitfall for the parent is that they expect it to be done, and they get very frustrated when it's not, and that they focus on their child's change and not their own. I've said this to families, and some people have misunderstood the intention, but I've said to families, the best way to approach this is expect that the other person in the equation, that nobody else in the family has changed. And some people, I had somebody tell me years ago, it sounds so pessimistic and negative. And I said, I don't mean it that way. I mean, the only effective focus is on you changing. So I think that's the biggest mistake, is that people think it's done. I sent my son to Wilderness, and he went to a therapeutic school afterwards, and he came home. And we weren't done by any stretch of the imagination. But we had a common language, a common experience, a different foundation, a different starting point. We still had challenges, in many ways more significant than before he went, because he went very young, 13 and 14. But we drew upon that, and still do to this day, on those early experiences. I still have in my mind significant experiences and letters and conversations and a field visit that affect me to this day, that inform my parenting to this day, and so does he. He came back to work for me years later. It's been sober for 8 years now. But we weren't out of the woods, and it was okay. It was okay. It was just a different way of being with each other. And I'd already been a therapist, but still, there was something that we did together as a family. So those are the biggest mistakes and pitfalls. So staying on the journey is the best way. And the most successful factor in transition and work is expect it to be work, not celebration and conclusion. My son is 19 years old, spent 12 weeks at Entrada, and has been in an aftercare program for 5 months, which provides tremendous independence and opportunity to do what interests you. I'm told he's a high-functioning participant there, holding down a job, taking a college course, but when he comes to therapy, they say he continues to be a tough nut to crack. He continues to cooperate with this path because we are his only way back to college, and he started, which is his #1 goal this spring. He has been sober since late January, except for one relapse at Aftercare. I'm anxious and scared to allow him to return to the college where his life blew up. Yet I feel like he deserves a chance to prove himself after all the work he's been through since January. Do you have any thoughts on how much we should control in his life, like drug testing? Are we stupid to give him a second chance at the same college? Smoking pot has helped him mask the stress in life, and given that it's legal and so commonly used. Um, is that part two? I think it is part two. There's a second part to it. Especially with musicians in his college. I feel like abstinence from pot for him will be challenging to say the least. I wish he could continue to work with his therapist from Entrada as he was impactful. Since leaving Evoke, our son has not had the same respect for his therapist and seems to be going through the motions until he leaves. I appreciate any advice on how to best support his success and also protect our sanity. We've told him we have two other sons and our lives as well. So please make this your time. Make your time on earth meaningful. Thank you. Very well spoken, very well articulated, and great question. I think I can't answer specifically when is the right time for you to change your level of accountability. I talk all the time about what you feel comfortable with. And so there's no one right way. It's more about, again, it's more about the thinking that goes into it. My experience is that it's never what do I do, but it's how am I thinking about it? What are the principles involved? So that's why being with a good parent coach, a good parent, we have coaching as a part of our program now. So if you go to our website, call admissions people, we have parent coaches that do this work. Our therapists at both Entrada and Cascade. So we have that now. But being with somebody that can help you learn how to think about the solution, eventually you're right. Eventually you're going to have to figure out that the accountability has to change. But you always have the right to it if you're providing support. And you might think, see, this is something I've realized in the past couple of months, maybe even less than that, maybe 6 weeks. I was talking to somebody and they were talking about similar kinds of challenges. And they were talking about how their home therapist told them to back off. And I've heard a lot of people quote a lot of home therapists saying that the answer is to back off. And I've realized for the first time what the problem with that is. The home therapist doesn't follow up with, and it might blow up. And he might get himself or herself into a hole. They might relapse and regress, and it might be a disaster in many ways. And that's okay. They don't ever say that part. They make the suggestion to back off, like if you back off, you'll get the outcome that you want. That's not what they ought to be saying. What they ought to be saying is, I think the dynamic is unhealthy. I think maybe if you back off, he can fall and it can become more relevant. And you've given them some tools. And regression and mistakes and poor choices are part of the learning process. Stay engaged, stay vigilant, stay aware, keep healthy boundaries, keep working on yourself, but don't try to prevent mistakes forever, right? So I don't know how to answer the question except for to say it's a way of being. It's a new sensibility. And I'm glad that you're asking it. I'm glad that you're on the webinar. Keep listening to the podcast. Keep reading the book. Read my book. Read Parenting from the Inside Out. Go to my personal website. Look at the 10 recommendations that I give on the book page, drbradreedy.com, and go there. Come to an intensive, a therapeutic intensive. Do deeper work for yourself. And just do your work. Stay out of the back and forth with your son about trying to prove to him that you're doing the right thing. Do stop that. Don't try to convince him that you're right or that he has to be okay with it or happy about it or agree with it. You just do it and let him be mad. And be empathic with him when he's mad. And say things like, I might be wrong. You might be right, I might be wrong. And learn how to lose. I've been talking about this a lot lately. Learn how to lose. Learn how to be an idiot and say, I might be an idiot. Stop trying to convince him or yourself that you're right, absolutely, and just do the best you can. I hope that helps. My son is at week 9 at Evoke. We are visiting residential treatment centers this week. He knows he'll be leaving Evoke soon. I was ready for a regression when he got to his RTC. However, I was taken aback at his letters this week. It felt like 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. It made me want to stay for him to stay at Evoke later. After our parent therapist call, it sounds like our son is really showing regression, even though his anxiety isn't centered on going to a residential treatment center. I need to work more on a regression plan and how to respond to his anxiety. Any suggestions on how to further explore what the regression plan might look like in our family? Fantastic question. I'm glad you asked it. Wonderful thinking and wonderful focus, right? You need to figure out how to respond to it. I'll say it this way, and I don't want to be too philosophical, but how can I be in relationship to my child's regression? There's a webinar on regression, a podcast on regression. Go watch or listen to that. It's a different it's seeing regression. Folks, you have trauma, right? Some of your children were participating in life-threatening, if not life-debilitating or self-sabotaging behaviors. You have trauma. Trauma is the opposite. Trauma responses are the opposite of response flexibility. Read parenting from the inside out. And really the answer is do more and more of your work. Come to the intensive, go to a personal intensive, do your work. It's ironic, and it's not a blame mentality, but it will change you. And changing you, you'll feel differently. You have new ears, new eyes, and you'll feel differently about what's going on. You'll think about it differently. And in all of that, you'll then respond differently. So do your work, regression, webinar, podcast, go to an intensive, go to Al-Anon. Those are people, Al-Anon and CODA, and Families Anonymous. Those are places where people are going where they have loved ones that are participating in self-sabotaging, damaging, and addictive patterns in their life. How do I be in a relationship with a person like that? Okay? Hope that helps. I know we are told that our child will regress when they leave the wilderness program, but why does that have to happen? And how long is it expected time? I think it just has to happen because it's human nature. Because the box is so small here. And you're right, we can't keep them here forever. We can keep them here for a while, but we can't keep them here forever. And they've kind of got to figure it out on their own. It's how people learn. And some of our children, they have to make every mistake more than once to kind of figure it out. And when we can maintain our own serenity, our own boundaries also, and know what I just said is true, we can respond to them with clarity, strength, and compassion at the same time, and patience. Believe me, I wish it was not as difficult as a father, for sure. Why does transitioning to an aftercare program have to be so long, 12 to 15 months? Why isn't they're not shorter transitions to get the child home? The answer is experience, really. I was talking to a consultant recently, and they said, I think I mentioned on a previous webinar that there are programs that are 6 and 9 months, and they said, Brad, that's not happening anymore. Those models are gone. And so I think it's just experience. When we started in 1998, I believe our average length of stay was 7.1 weeks, if I remember correctly, the first year. And now it's more like 9.1 weeks. And that wasn't because we wanted to make more money. That wasn't because we had a theoretical bias that people needed more. That's just because we just saw experientially that it worked better. Right? It just works better that way. So that's the answer. It's really a practical thing. Al-Anon is about healthy detachment. But when a child has to be involved in life-threatening behavior, how can one detach? Very, very difficultly. It's hard. That's why you need support. See, I talk about this. Your children, especially the ones participating in life-threatening things, they require more bandwidth than another child. So you need more support. And by the way, more detachment doesn't mean more passivity. Right? People who go to Al-Anon and work the program are more assertive, more honest, more courageous than those who don't. In many cases, not all cases, of course, it's all individual. But people sometimes think detachment is about not caring, or detachment is about passivity or uninvolvement. It's not. It's changing the focus. It's changing the involvement. The serenity prayer. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change and the courage to change the things I can. That's the courage piece, right? It's hard to focus on what and act on what I need to change. It's hard to let go of what I can. So I just want to be clear. An Al-Anoner is, and I'm speaking generally, an Al-Anoner is more assertive, more authentic, more courageous, more active. And I think if we adopt the Al-Anon thinking, more loving. They're less reactive. They're less trauma-based. They're less controlling. They're less anxious, less depressed, right? So it helps you to be in a healthier relationship with somebody. That doesn't mean doing less or doing nothing. Sometimes you have to make big, difficult, scary decisions, and that's where the Al-Anon support can help you. All right, last question before we end tonight. My daughter has been in aftercare since March and is pretty close to moving to the next phase, which will bring her to home visits. I am so thankful about the comment about working on my own relapse and regression program. I appreciate the co-participation comments also. The triangle between me, my husband, and our daughter is a great concern for me. Sometimes I really have to watch for and be thoughtful about this as our relationship is more of a struggle. You know, as I close, I just want to say that what I often say, which is your children don't need you to be perfect. They just need you to make your life your project. That's your project, your life. And then part of that project of being a parent is to parent. But we really do learn to parent differently. I'm a different parent now because of my work, my personal work, not my professional work, although there's some overlap in mine specifically. But I'm a different parent to my 9-year-old child that I have right now than I was to my 24, 25-year-old child 15 years ago because of my own personal work. I'm not more passive. I'm not less assertive. I'm more honest, more courageous. I think more loving. I have more capacity. And that's really the important aspect of love that I look at. It's not the feeling of love, it's the capacity, right? If love is just a feeling that we have or a dependence that we have, it has very little value. I've heard people report that they love their children that they are physically or sexually abusing. I've heard spouses who abuse their spouses say, I love her. So love's got to be more than just a feeling. It's got to be about capacity. Like Gandhi says, if we love other as other, we have heroically taken on the responsibility of our own differentiation, our own journey. And this heroism may properly be called love. And that's really what my book is about. The heroic journey of the parent is about developing more capacity, doing your work. That's the hero's journey. It's inward, right? That's what Joseph Campbell, the philosopher, is talking about in the hero's journey. We go out for the grail, but the grail is not the thing that we find. We find a new version of ourselves. You know, Rocky didn't win his first fight. Rocky was a classic hero's journey. But Rocky was changed, right? And the winning the fight wasn't the thing. And I know it's different than a child. We love our children much more than we love a heavyweight boxing title. But the principle applies the same. We think we're doing this to save our children, and we would do anything for our children. And what you folks who show up on a nightly and weekly basis show them and me is you're willing to make your life your project, to listen to things, to be challenged by things, to ask yourself difficult questions. All right, folks, I hope this has been a helpful point of contact. Any leftover questions, I'll answer on the open forum next week. We ask all parents to go to 612-step support groups. You can go to the websites, alanon.org, coda.org, or familiesanonymous.org to find meetings in your area. You can also go to NAMI.org, NAMI.org, to get resources and education classes in your area. Please, if you're on social media, even if you just log on to Twitter, just follow us because announcements are made there. We're announcing all of our parent meetings that are coming now in the fall, other events that we sponsor. You can listen to all these webinars on a podcast for the rest of your life. The podcasts are to the public, so you can offer them to friends and acquaintances also. If you have an iPhone, you go to the podcast app and you search Evoke Therapy Programs. If you have an Android device, download the SoundCloud app and search Evoke Therapy Programs. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram. On Facebook, you can search Evoke Therapy Programs. On the Second Nature Alumni Foundation page on Facebook, you can learn about an organization that helps people that can't afford therapy. And you can go to our blog. Of course, my book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available on Amazon. If you look at the buying options there, it's available. The Amazon warehouse is out of stock, but there are other buying options where you can buy a new book. So just click on that button there. Or you can go to barnesandnoble.com. You can also get an audio version of it. Go to the Parent Alumni Foundation page on Amazon through the Amazon Smiles program. You can buy recommended books from our therapists, and a percentage of the proceeds goes toward the Alumni Foundation. Nashville is tonight. So if you're in Nashville and you're at the parent meeting, you're not watching this. I'll be in New York City on September 13th, Los Angeles on September 24th, the Bay Area in Corte Madera on Monday the 25th. In Washington, D.C., we decided today it's going to be Thursday, October 12th. You can also see the Wilderness play there that's playing at the Kennedy Center. We're also going to have a reception there. In Chicago, it'll be sometime during the week of the 13th. Toronto, to be determined. Email Andrea@evoketherapy.com for more information. If you want to do deeper work on yourselves, we have intensives and workshops coming up. The workshops, we invite all families to. We hope all families can come. The next one is September 23rd and 24th at Entrada. Contact Gail at evoketherapy.com to RSVP or for more information. And I run the Finding You workshops. These are 6-person workshops where we go deeply into your family of origin, kind of finding out who you are and making sense out of that in terms of your parenting or your relationships today. You don't have to be a parent of a child at Evoke to go to these. Somewhere near half of our participants aren't, so about half are. The next 2 are listed there. You can also do a private family one. You can also do a Pursuits program, which is a high adventure program. Kind of think of it as therapy light. Go to intensives at Evoke or email at intensives@evoketherapy.com for more information or call admissions. You can also learn about our Pursuits program there. All right, folks. I hope this was a helpful point of contact. Thank you for staying on extra time tonight. Have a great evening. I'll talk to you next Tuesday, the 5th of September. We're already into September. Hope you have a happy and safe Labor Day weekend. And that webinar will be an open forum. We'll be doing those once a week now. So you can submit any questions before then, or you can also attend live and bring any questions that you have, any topics you want to talk about. Have a great weekend, folks. Take care, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.